Ni'n troi'n golygon nawr at Ewrop a thu hwnt i hynny yn ystod y sesiwn nesaf yma, oherwydd ni'n cael cwmni Peter Griffiths. Peter is formerly of the London School of Economics. He's consulted to cities across Europe on maximising investment. He's a global urban futurist. Do you mind if I say it again? I just love that title, a global urban futurist. It's just making my imagination zing, to be completely honest. So he does, of course, bring an international perspective to answering the question, are all towns going to become smart? Croeso I ateb. Peter, diolch.
Thank you very much. And I think the previous speaker is also an LSE alum, so it's not just me. But thank you so much for hosting me here today. It is let me find my slides. It is a big question and intentionally provocative. What I do as an urban futurist is try and help places, organizations think what's coming next and how they get there. But you might have noticed that I have a Welsh surname. And I've gone all the way back to the 17th century and haven't found the grandfather born in Wales who's gifted me that surname. So I'm still working on the past, but we'll focus a bit on the future today. All right, so maybe going straight to international. I happened to be at an investment conference earlier in the week, and one of the projects that was being presented, you may or may not know, Saudi Arabia, NEOM, trying to build this 170-kilometer long line of city, which I won't say too many personal comments on it, but when you stretch a city out spatially over such a distance, you run into some particular spatial challenges. You can try and solve that with technology. So what they're trying to do is use high-speed rail. They're trying to do more mixed-use development with the idea, how can we make sure people don't move too far? And the reason that I'm bringing this up is because many of the towns that you come from, actually your high streets are a very small version of this. You've got a line. And infrastructure can only solve so much of that. And technology can only solve so much of that. So there's some questions to be asking right at the start, like what are the spatial constraints of what we're trying to achieve on place? Another way of looking at this is that not all towns will survive forever. So 1500s, War and Percy, there was tech disruption. Actually, the town stopped existing. Resource, something much more recent, actually in China in the 90s, towns started depopulating because the infrastructure to connect and the opportunities weren't there. But the one that I actually find the most interesting is in Namibia. So this town made a lot of money out of diamonds and actually had the first X-ray center in Southern Africa. It had the first tramway in Africa. A lot of technology, but still didn't survive. And so sometimes it's worth thinking about, well, if places don't change, you know, what is the option? And I'd say that becoming smart is one of the ways of changing. So it's definitely worth thinking about how a place stays relevant for longer. So if we are to think about what is smart, like what is it that makes a place smart? So there are probably four kind of top things that we need to be thinking about. The one is fragmentation. So tying together successes across the region. So an anecdote I can share is I worked with a local authority last year and realized that they had 5 smart tourism pilots all happening at the same time with no joined up conversations in between them, which is just a missed opportunity. The other is data to identify patterns, predict opportunities, so it's what good things, but also mitigate risks. Accelerate innovation, so leverage ideas in connection, and that's both people, but also bringing together a lot of the services, sectors, making that work together. And then there's brand agreement. So yeah, previous conversation about, I really love social media analysis. I find it super interesting. But what tends to happen with brand is the value can be lost in ambiguity. And what I mean by that is if you were to say we're a smart place and half the people in your population don't agree, actually it just makes it that little bit harder for the uptake to happen. So smart place really requires a more systematic understanding of smart and its benefits. And it just happens that those not supposed to be those colors, but that's all right. We'll work with it. If we think about it, some of the benefits, improved services, so real-time understanding of what's actually happening in your place, better planning, evidence-based decisions, we spoke a bit about that this morning, greater impact, thinking about areas of efficiency, but then also stronger communication. so involving citizens and stakeholder groups. And part of the communication is also being able to help people see what's there. There's value in every place, but it's not going to be visible to everyone. So how do you make sure that people can see this? So there were lots of case studies this morning. These case studies are all on our website. Orange is a bit jarring to look at. I'm going to go through them really, really quickly. But in a sense, just to illustrate some of these values, Antwerp, they wanted to reduce emissions in their city. They introduced some smart charging for parking. And you can see from the graph the dramatic decrease in emissions over time. Another example in Sweden, a 70% reduction in the energy costs in a building through both a retrofit and then engaging the residents in the building with some of the information, so some of the behavioral change aspects of that. Closer to where we are now, in Cardiff, many smart bins examples around the world. What I like about the Cardiff example is that they didn't just introduce the smart bins, they actually had an aspect where with AI and feedback from residents, they were able to get a much richer picture on what was working. So that aspect of bringing residents into the conversation, I think, is key to improving the quality of data sets. Another example in Cologne, extracting heat from sewage systems, to mostly for the benefit of public buildings and schools. A big drive to making sure that we're not wasting resources that are right in front of us. On the area of risk, so Dublin City Council, with actually a fairly small investment with some sensors upriver, believe that they might save up to €100 million a year in early flood warning. So actually some of the benefits can be fairly substantial. And then I seem to have lost the slide. There we go. So just in terms of Barcelona, an example that I particularly like, they realized that, and this goes back to actually the previous slide, that school-based transport offered for SEN children with additional needs, they realized there that actually their costs to their public transport were enormous for people with additional needs. And they thought, well, can we have assisted transport to bring more of these people into the public services? And they realized there in the first year alone, they saved over €1.5 million, just in terms of making public transport more accessible to people who would otherwise need private services. So if we look at the kind of the big picture, places are getting smarter and greener every day. We're seeing that actually the global smart place market is doubling every 3 to 4 years, so there's an incredible amount of money that's going into this. But what this also presents is an opportunity to benefit for this, or conversely, the risk of being left behind. And so it's really a good conversation to be having. But given that we are in Wales and that we are in Wrexham, there we go, I thought it's worth deciding, well, what about rural areas? Is smart really about rural places? This happens to be quite close to where I live, where there's a plan to put sensors into the riverways, primarily to reduce runoff pollution from farming. It's a big farming community, it's a UNESCO World Biosphere. Actually, that's all at risk from the way that we use land in rural areas too. It's not just urban and towns. And so if you happen to be from a smaller place and you're thinking, well, maybe this isn't for me, there are plenty of examples across Europe and across the world where smart is changing rural places too. You might also be asking why now. There we go. And that's difficult to read. Sorry about the colors. Partly just the size of the market. You know, there's this big push, and from some of the questions that were asked this morning, well, isn't there an incentive to be pushing this if you're an organization? And yes, there is. But there's also an increased demand for participation from residents and citizens. So how do local authorities manage that in an effective way? There's accelerated digitalization. There's just more data than we've ever had before. And largely AI has come about because we need some way of dealing with this. From a political point of view, there's also a big push towards net zero, inclusive, and economic growth. So tech can play a role in that. And then there's some big pressing urban challenges around budget cuts and actually aging infrastructure, changes in demographics. So there's a lot coming together to to require us to need new solutions, and some of those solutions will undoubtedly be smart. Just so you know, some of the information that I'm bringing, so Bable organization that I work for, we have a knowledge base that includes over 200 cities and regions, over 800 case studies. These are all on our website, so you're welcome to grab a look. If you wanted to join the community, it's free. And really, we came into existence because we wanted places to know what was possible. And then as a next step, whether it worked or not, because that's the key aspect of this all. So if we have a look at where we're seeing investment in smart across European cities and regions and towns too, most of the investment is going to energy, mobility, and building. And that makes sense because that happens to be where most emissions are concentrated. So actually the investment tying to net zero achievement makes a lot of sense, but then also a lot of money going into information, communication, and technology. So many of the case studies that were referenced this morning fit into that category. Sensors, getting data on what's happening in place. But then waste, next one. But the ones that I almost think are the most interesting is health, inclusion, and safety. So Dave, you mentioned having the smart benches actually around inclusion, making sure that young women weren't left isolated late at night wanting to charge their phones. Example of inclusion and safety. What we're seeing more and more is that where local authorities are wanting to bring these initiatives online, they're having to tie them to these other categories. So just something to be thinking about. If you're wanting to improve inclusion and safety and health in your cities, think about the investments in energy, mobility, and buildings that you can tag along with. Where should I be pointing the clicker? There we go. I'll skip that slide. Right. So I thought, just on the sentiment analysis, so I worked on a project quite a few years ago that tried to look at the impact of online news and social media mentions across 250 cities globally. And the big reason was, does this matter? Should we really be investing in this kind of content? And what we found is that actually city-level GDP and the amount of mentions was very tightly correlated. So effectively, if somebody's not talking about you, you're less likely to have investment. So my sense is that AI is going to make this even worse, because what AI tends to do is it extracts things that already exist to create a further picture of what is there. So particularly for smaller towns, this is something of a concern. But where I do think smart plays into this is that data becomes really key, not just to urban management, but conversely also to brand. So I know there are lots of placemaking people in the room. Definitely a message that I think is worth taking on board is that your open data strategies ultimately are going to impact the ability of investors to be able to find your place and invest in it. So it's not just about data for urban management, it's also very tightly correlated with brand. So maybe if we take a big step back, because I know that I've given you a lot of information already, kind of seeing 6 big transformations happening across the European innovation ecosystem that might be worth just having in the back of your mind. So the one is digitalization, more data, more AI. So I've spoken a bit about that. The other is the future of work, new work patterns, more remote working, people getting older, shifting that, but also automation and age tech. So what is going to happen to work patterns, and should we be considering that, particularly with inner city regen and town center regen? There's energy transition, security, and decarbonization. So it's not just that our buildings need to use less energy, it's the challenge of making sure that there is enough energy where we need it more locally. There's smart mobility, ports, and logistics, so moving people and goods around, but also ideas. And after COVID, questioning whether we should move at all. So actually some very big disruptions in terms of how we model mobility. There's the idea of intelligent carbon neutral buildings. And I really like this space as a mixed-use space and a multi-use space. But increasingly what you'll see is that the idea of having a building that's just for one use will become increasingly difficult to justify. And technology will need to support that in some way or other. And then there's the aspect of connected urban realm, decentralization, and social value. And the connected urban realm, I think, is really key because if you look at the UK, last 10 or 20 years, very little investment in the urban realm and the public realm. There's a lot of catch-up now in terms of public space design and thinking about the urban realm, but this is where a lot of these technologies land. And so actually, if we do want to have smart and enabled places, we've also got to think about the investment in the public realm. And then on top of all of this, there's some need for some kind of smart place specialization. So where does this land? How can people find it once you've put it all together? How am I doing for time? Good. Brilliant. So maybe just some strategies. So going much broader. So this is some work we did. It was actually referenced in the PT presentation this morning. So we did Belfast Innovation District Strategy a few years ago, which is a £1 billion strategy. And when we started, we actually looked much more at the regional scale. What's happening outside Belfast? What are the critical sectors and the clusters that can be brought together? And the reason that I'm putting this slide up is because in many cases, smaller towns are going to have to be thinking about what's around them too. What are the clusters that can be developed around them? It's going to be impossible to find everything locally. And as part of the strategy, it's also, we looked at, well, you could be a lab, which is a very controlled environment. You could be a test bed, which is where you let some of your ideas free in the wild a little bit. Or you could target specific sectors, this would be a smart industry, or you could become a smart district, a particular location in a city, all as a building block then to becoming a smart city. In Belfast, they decided they were going to go with a smart district approach, so don't cover the whole city at once, but then also have a regional side to the clustering. And the next slide that I was trying to show you is that it's also the need to choose and where you're going to focus. So in the case of Belfast, there were over 100 projects that were identified for investment. So actually, where do you start? And we realized that the biggest challenge that they had was actually a data challenge. So we needed to start developing a data ecosystem. In their case, and in many other places, mobility is the best place to start, just because you get such a rich data set in terms of how place is being consumed and used. And so building out an urban data platform with mobility at the start. Idea of smart, healthy neighborhoods, having to convince people that there was a benefit. So bringing in data to show, well, actually people in a neighborhood where the intervention has happened, they're healthier, they're living longer, they're having less trips to the NHS. Some easy wins. And then the final is looking at sustainable energy economy and thinking about which kinds of investments there had to come online to support some of the, so that it's not just road-based emissions reductions, but actually maybe within the energy sector too. How do those two work together? So the reason that I raise this is because undoubtedly, even in a town context, there will be hundreds of projects that demand investment and attention. But how can each project be used as a building block towards a smart transition within your place? Looking even wider, we also happen to do a smart specialization strategy for Wales a few years ago. I'm not going to go into it in much detail. You can definitely read it online. But what I am going to do is skip forward to this slide. And one of the things that we noticed is when we try to identify where the areas of specialization were, was that we didn't see very clear differences between each place in terms of the different sectors that were and labor force arrangements in those places. And so one of the things which a step towards smart, I say, for smart towns is getting that level of data granularity so that you can really identify what is it that's unique and special about each place. Because that'll be a key aspect of helping target investments. I think this should probably be online. It should be a public document. So if anybody wants to know more about this, I'm happy to chat more afterwards. So you're probably wondering now, what do I do next? What should I be taking away from this presentation? So there are some building blocks if you want a cheat sheet for a smart transition strategy. So one is capacity. So training staff, making sure that you've got the capacity within your local authority. You need lots of Daves. From a governance point of view, understanding what smart cities or smart places are and what smart policy is, it's going to have an impact on how you govern. So a good example of this is did a project in London where I wanted to identify funding for a big investment, and within a few months realized that actually the council was spending that money already across 3 teams and could quite easily restructure and achieve what they wanted to. But the governance arrangement wasn't there. So they've gone and spent more money to get another study to tell them that maybe the same thing as we've already said, but we'll see. There's always hope. So in terms of data, using data to provide coherency and integration. So the big thing about data is it's only useful if you can tie it to a geography, and then you can use it flexibly across different geographies. So there's a lot of work that needs to happen there. In terms of procurement, accelerating smart across all spending. So it might be that within your council, your biggest areas of spend are not digital or smart, but that doesn't mean that they can't be used strategically to achieve digitalization and smart outcomes. Vision, having some kind of smart placemaking and brand, and there's been good work towards that. Actions to take next, identify those projects that are foundational, or think about a roadmap or a smart action plan. Some kind of spatial coordination, so not administrative, but regional. What's happening around you? What can you leverage? And then also innovation, so enable difference and connection. Because ultimately, if I think about innovation, it's using what you've got better. That's the aim. So how do you bring it together in a more effective way? All right. But not all smart town projects work, and actually we've seen that sometimes as many as 4 and 5 projects fail. And so how do we make sure that doesn't happen? So some of the reasons why these initiatives fail is that there's just no clear plan or objectives, and there's fragmented ownership over smart. So make sure that whoever's in your town is at a level that they can tell people what to do if you want to become smart. So give David promotion. So public sector procurement and over-reliance on public money. So we know that national government money has decreased year on year over the last decade. It's probably not going to change. So where are the other sources of capitals? Either through internal savings, through private partners, or increasingly we're finding that there's money from the third sector in terms of philanthropy. So there are pockets of money out there that can be identified. Where's that going to come from? So closed architectures and vendor lock-ins. So a good example of this, did a project, smart bins. The pilot was very successful. The council then had to procure, and the bins that ended up being procured, the second round, didn't talk to the first set of bins, and everything fell apart. So procurement can be a particular stumbling block. There's also the idea it's a game for grown-ups. London, Cardiff, they can do it. But increasingly we're seeing smart applications everywhere. Digital divides and lack of community engagement and trust. So that's both within the council, but then also within communities. And then the final area is just trying to do it alone or piloting mature tech in isolation. So again, there's a lot of technology that is actually quite mature. It doesn't need to be piloted anymore and can just be used off the shelf. So trying to make sure that whatever it is you're putting into your place, whether you need to build it from scratch or not. All right, so I've got 2 last things that I want to chat to you about. The one is AI, which we haven't spoken to at all about today. So, and I'm just some insights from over 30 plus case studies of AI across Europe. So we're saying it's impacting every sector. It's impacting every place, big and small. It's cross geography, and actually it's not recent. It goes back a few years already. We've been seeing it. So it's gained a lot of attention now, but actually it's been there in the background for a while. And if we think about it, so a bit of sentiment analysis, so Dublin City Council trying to get a much more granular picture of how citizens and residents are feeling across the region, trying to get a richer picture. And again, these are all on our website, so you're welcome to see them there. Another example during COVID, so Swiss cities using AI to make sure that people were wearing their masks in different locations and seeing if there was a link to public health announcements and whether public policy was actually delivering a measurable result. Another example going all the way down to the building scale in Toronto, using AI as a way tied to building management systems to give people a much more personalized experience of place within a building. So the building might know what kind of temperature you like when you're in the room. It might be able to predict rooms that you might want to book, giving a much sense of, I belong here, this place knows me, that sense of place. But we can expand that all the way out to the city or the municipality. So the example in Sandefjord in Norway of just having a really basic chatbot with 2,000 plus pre-programmed FAQ questions. So that when people arrived on the website, they could find the information really quickly that they wanted. What they found is that phone calls into the municipality and emails went down significantly for basic questions. And as a result, they could deal with the real things. So actually quite a strong link to the previous presentation, get that communication layer right, the role that AI plays with that. And then also just how infrastructure is configured. So this idea in Leipzig with virtual power plant, more and more people are putting solar panels on their roofs. They might have a wind turbine in the back garden, might have a battery in their car in the garage. How does this all come together? And so in the past, we've thought about infrastructure as these big, heavy things that exist in isolation, and increasingly, tools like AI are helping us tie them together as actually bring coherency across things that are quite disaggregated. So what impact does that have on your place? So two big impacts from AI that probably worth thinking. The one is labor disruption, which is where the media is focused at the moment. This isn't a new challenge in a sense. If you go back to the Industrial Revolution, as soon as you mechanize anything, you change the way that people do things and you provide more time. So it's not, that in a sense is not entirely new. What I think is new is the idea of disrupting the product ecosystem. So how many of you have iPhones? Right, how many of you have iPhones because the iPhone works well with all your other Apple products? Right, now that's an ecosystem. And it's an ecosystem that is premised on proprietary access. So it's a locked ecosystem. Now that is true for products, it's true for data, it's actually true for some of the administrative units of your town areas. They're walled gardens in a sense. There's a big likelihood that AI is going to disrupt that. And it's going to find a way for iPhones to talk to Samsung phones, and actually that distinction is potentially going to become less relevant. When that happens, a lot of the ways that we see technology and the distinctions between technology is going to shift and change. But there's another change which I think is worth thinking about, and that is Web 3. How many of you have heard of Web 3? Yeah, all right. So if you go back in time, Web 1, good old days, there's some websites on the internet, but you could only read it, and it was fragmented. Web 2, think social media, you're able to say what you think so you can read and write. A lot of platform concentration. So if you think Google, Facebook, all in one place. Web 3 adds another dimension to read and write. It adds ownership. So if you think about things like Bitcoin or NFCs, which are tokens that relay some sense of who whatever belongs to, that changes the relationship to content. And it also creates a promise of decentralization because you don't need a platform to tell you who owns what. Now, the reason I'm raising that is because this might have an impact on place too. So if you look at, let's say, urban sprawl that happened in the 70s and 80s and 90s, happens to overlap with Web 1's development. If you think about reurbanization and the reinterest in city centers, Web 2, same time period. So what does Web 3 mean? Are we seeing that actually there's going to be some kind of a promise of decentralization? And should we be expecting that people are going to want more evenness in terms of technology? Are they going to expect that it's not just located in the town centers, which changes our models of town center regen potentially? So these are all big shifts which are worth considering. And then the other aspect is around shared ownership and expectation that people can somehow maintain ownership. So this photo, for example, an artist, typically the gentrification curve is that artists will come into an area, make it look nice, and investors will profit from that. If there's some form of shared ownership through an NFC, there's a way for that artist to continue generating value out of that investment in place. So this changes a little bit how towns work. There's the idea of shared building. So actually the expert isn't necessarily the only expert in the room anymore. More and more people are able to contribute to what place looks like, what kind of tools are in place to accommodate that. There's decentralized but now seamless infrastructure. So a few months ago, I was in Barcelona and Google told me that there was a nice easy route to get to where I wanted to be. Halfway I had to buy another ticket. I can't tell you how frustrating that was. It felt like I'd been cheated and lied to. And then the last thing is just demand for faster feedback. So if we think Eurovision, oh, I see. Sorry about that. Nobody told me that the slides weren't moving. See? That's why we need... Yeah. Should have had faster feedback. See? It's the last comment there. But, yeah, in a sense, Eurovision frivolous, but actually 5-year periods of mandate delivery is actually... how does technology augment that? You know, if we think about political cycles. Right, so if you want to engage with any of this, we have added AI to a training program. So there's the soft sell. And in terms of if you want access to any of the case studies there on our platform, you're welcome to join it. I know many of you are already engaging with it. And yeah, that is me. Thank you so much.